Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi guys. Boxing's best pound for pound superstar Jaron Ennis is finally back, and the man who is fighting is the undefeated unified super welterweight champion Xander Zayas. Now, honestly, firstly, this is a really high level matchup. We all know that, right? This is probably Boots's biggest superstardom opportunity of all time. I know this guy obviously has a lot of knockouts, almost 95% knockout rate, I believe, which is absolutely insane. Not only that, but also he's undefeated, and his fighting style and everything, right? It just screams superstardom, and he is basically the man who Terence Crawford avoided, you could say. And honestly, when he gives statements like, for example, I'm at Terence Crawford level, he says shit like that in interviews, right? Firstly, the casuals might think that's a bit of an overstatement. These types of cocky fighters, right, they get caught at some point or not. But in my opinion, if you guys think about it, realistically, right, because Terence Crawford did avoid the fight. He did avoid the fight casually. He wasn't hiding it. Terence Crawford's impression for Boots was basically fighting him is a lose-lose situation. So he didn't really buy into, it's not like he avoided Boots as greatest. He constantly praised Boots and respected him as as an individual. He wasn't claiming shit like that Boots is a fraud or something. But the thing is, even the fact that someone like Terence Crawford knew that he would probably have a really tough time against Jaron Boots, and that just tells you how good this guy actually is. And seeing some of his highlights, it's incredible, bro. Like, this guy, his punch accuracy, speed, footwork, it's just to the point, bro. And honestly, I'm not surprised, right, that this guy, he has been treating, he has been treated like such a superstar by, for example, the Ring magazine, right? It 100% deserves it, bro. Not it's not just his fighting style, but also as a personality, right? Like, he's always usually so humble, and he knows how to carry himself as a superstar for sure. I won't say he's like the most promotable one. For example, he's definitely not someone similar to, let's say, Tyson Fury or Ben Whittaker, right? He's his personality, it's not like super cocky or trash talks a lot, not like that. But from a professional standpoint, right? For example, really similar to Terence Crawford. I'm not saying Crawford was the most promotable one during his time, but similar to that. And honestly, at this point, I just want him to get the opportunities that he actually does deserve. Maybe after this, he fights someone like, for example, the winner of Tim Tszyu versus Errol Spence. That'll honestly be a really good fight, to be honest, for Boots. But for now, Xander Zayas, I know this guy is undefeated, obviously the unified champion right now. He's the one defending his belts, but at this point, I don't think he has he stands a chance against Boots, especially if Boots is able to apply the game plan that he is planning to do, right? Because I've seen in what was his name, Showtime, right? Yeah, I've seen in Showtime's breakdowns that he said that 80% of the chance is this fight will go Boots' way, and the way in which Boots wants to play this game. And if that's the case, it'll be a long night for sure for Xander Zayas, and he probably won't even make it out of the round 12 standing. And the thing is, I know Boots, even though he does have a lot of first round finishes, usually he doesn't rush a knockout, right? He likes to get in the game slowly but surely. Like, it's he isn't someone like, for example, Ben Whittaker or Moses Tama. Even though he is that level, his superstardom is at that level. Like, he is being promoted like those guys, but he's just not like that. He obviously has a lot of knockouts, no discrediting that. But when it comes to his finishing ability, it's usually a bit late, and not as fast as those guys. That's what I'm saying. But for now, honestly, I just can't wait for the fight tomorrow. My personal prediction is I obviously am backing Boots Ennis by a 6th round knockout, maybe, hopefully. And even if it does go past rounds, let's say 7 or 8, still I personally don't reckon that it'll go to the distance. But even if it does, I feel like both Boots will definitely win it, especially even potentially getting a few 10-8 rounds maybe, because his power and punch accuracy, as I said, is absolutely insane, bro. And this guy, he's definitely a problem for the entire super welterweight division. If he decides to move up to middleweight or even super middleweight, right, then even though he might be a bit undersized for those divisions, but still in my opinion, like in those divisions, there are a lot more superstars for him to face compared to here. And he isn't someone who, for example, Canelo Alvarez will be will try to avoid, because he knows that he has the size advantage. Even though he had that for Crawford. Crawford was obviously in a whole different game, and for somewhat whatever reason, I guess it is normal for them to think this way. But Canelo still believes that he will beat Crawford in a rematch. As I said, like he obviously has the right to think so, and it's probably really normal for him to do so. But still, it's just absolutely insane. But yeah, anyways, that's my take on this, guys. You guys have any question about what you guys think? Inshallah, I'll see you guys next time. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.